Give folks a minute to log in, then we'll get started. Okay. Do I have a thumbs up, Ms. Hartzell?
You are good to go.
Okay, welcome everyone to Courageous Conversations, a discussion about critical race theory, known as CRT. So many times you will see the acronym tossed around, CRT. And also our focus is going to be a more diverse curriculum in our schools. Now, this is an online discussion with NKU's Black and Brown Educators of Excellence student group and Cincinnati Public Radio's Democracy and Me interns, supported by NKU College of Education, Cincinnati Public Radio. We came together to talk about critical race theory and curriculum. So this is what the evening will look like. Facilitator introduction, housekeeping, defining critical race theory, panelist introductions, group discussion, audience discussion, group discussion, audience discussion, wrap up. And then actually I'll give you some homework. Then we'll talk about takeaways from today, okay? Takeaways, and that will be sort of your homework and what we will do moving forward, because our philosophy is that we don't need another just discussion, but let's think about some actionable items. Although this particular area does need discussion as well, so I don't want to dismiss that piece. Okay, so here's some in-class homework for you. I'm a teacher, so I'm going to give homework while we're in class. Shout out to my students that are here, to all the NKU students that came out to support this virtual webinar. I'm supposed to introduce myself. I'm Dr. David Childs. I'm a professor of social studies education and history at Northern Kentucky University. I'm the founder of Black and Brown Educators of Excellence, a co-founder. I do work around, I'm a historian by trade, but I've also been trained in theory and philosophy. And I do work around diversity and inclusion. And I've had some doctoral work and written about critical race theory. And so we felt that we would try to shed some more light on this particular topic. That's who I am. So in-class homework, kindly write down at least 2 discussion questions or statements in response to the conversation being had. There is a Q&A, so you want to look down. I believe it's towards the bottom. There's a Q&A section. It's open throughout the talk. And so throughout the discussion, you can raise your hand virtually when we get to the audience part. And so the first portion, we're going to privilege our students. And we do have a representative from some representatives from Cincinnati Public Radio, Julie Copeland. She's an expert also. She works in this area, but we will be trying to privilege the student voices. And so at the end, there'll be some time where the audience can ask questions. Now, if you want to be on camera, we can do that. And you will be able to speak and be on camera. But if you want to just remain off camera and we just ask a question, we can indicate that as well. While we are involved in the webinar, please tweet out or Facebook or post on Insta or text any thoughtful comments you hear from students or myself, or quotes or responses, or one of the panelists you hear throughout the night. You may use the hashtags democracy and me Dr. David Childs, 917 WVXU or NKU College of Education. Perhaps this can be placed in the chat, but Democracy and Me, Dr. David Childs, 917, you see them at the bottom there, WVXU, NKU COE, okay? So a little bit about Democracy and Me, Ms. Black, a little bit about Black and Brown Educators of Excellence. It's a student group here at Northern Kentucky University. It's a group that's designed to support Black and Brown students that have an interest in education. We aim to support students, even from now we're reaching back to middle school and high school, those that are interested in education. There's a teacher shortage, also administrative shortage throughout the nation, but even more of a shortage of educators of color. So we've developed some programming in the College of Education and across NKU campus to recruit teachers, particularly teachers of color. Some of you may have seen the grant we received recently to do that kind of work, but we also want to support graduate students in their master's or doctoral level that are interested in administration or even going to teach. And so that's something that the Black and Brown Educators is all about. I did want to give shout out to Dean Jenny Fair in the College of Education. She's been very supportive of this kind of work. And so, and all my colleagues in the College of Education, all my colleagues at NKU, Dr. Eric Jackson and different ones. Democracy and Me, this is out of our local NPR station. It's designed to, well, you can see some of the pointers here. We really are engaged with the youth. You'll see some of the youth today speaking. We want to give youth a voice to speak about civics, diversity, history, and education. Overall, Democracy and Me provides civics discussions for civics, diversity, history, and education, and providing resources for teachers in the community. I know a lot of folks probably know my work through Democracy and Me, and this is an extension of that. Okay, understanding critical race theory. This is the part where it may get a little technical. Some folks I know are here to learn a little bit more about critical race theory. And so we're going to do our best to condense it. As I said, full disclosure, one can spend a lifetime of study. Gloria Lasson-Billings, that's what she does. She talks about critical race theory as it relates to education. Her whole career has been built off of it. I've had an entire doctoral course, and done part of my dissertation work using critical race theory, part of my doctoral work. And so this is just really scratching the surface. So I'm going to attempt to really give you just a foundation before we go into our student discussion. Courageous Conversations come from Glenn Singleton's work, Courageous Conversations about Race. Derek Bell also talked about courage. And in relation to our title, Derek Bell was one of the founders of critical race theory. He says, courage is a decision you make to act in a way that works through your own fear for the greater good. So you make a decision working through your own fear for the greater good, as opposed to pure self-interest. So when you're courageous, you are suspending your own self-interest. Courage means putting at risk your immediate self-interest for what you believe is right. So taking a risk takers. Nowadays, it seems like to even talk about critical race theory, maybe it's taking a risk because it's so politically charged. Critical race theory as a national conversation. This material that I'm going to go into comes out of the American Bar Association from an article by Janelle George called A Lesson on Critical Race Theory from January 2021. In September 2020, President Trump issued an executive order excluding from federal contracts any diversity and inclusion training interpreted as containing divisive concepts, race or sex stereotyping, and race, quote unquote, race. So the training that was interpreted as divisive concepts, and he quotes, he says race or sex stereotyping, unquote, and quote, race or sex scapegoating, unquote. Among the content considered divisive is critical race theory. And so as a critical race scholar, humbly speaking, there are others that have gone way beyond me. But when I first heard Donald Trump mention critical race theory, I said to myself, to be honest, he can't possibly know what he's talking about. And so, because I had only heard about critical race theory in graduate school. In response to this legislature, the African American Policy Forum, led by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which is one of the founders of critical race theory, launched the Truth Be Told campaign to expose the harm that the order poses. Reports indicate that over 300 diversity inclusion trainings have been canceled as a result of the order, and over 120 civil rights organizations and allies signed a letter condemning the executive order. What exactly is CRT? Critical race theory, why is it under attack? Why is critical race theory under attack? What does it mean for the civil rights lawyer? Critical race theory is not a diversity and inclusion training. CRT, I repeat, is not a diversity inclusion, quote unquote, training, but a practice of interrogating the role of racism and race in society that emerged in the legal academy and spread to other fields of scholarship. Critical race theory has been around for about 40 years, and it has long been a scholarly pursuit in the same way that one would study theory of phenomenology or existentialism or pragmatism or prophetic pragmatism. It's a theoretical framework that primarily lives in graduate programs and gives us the tools to talk about society, to look at society, even critique society. Related is critical pedagogy. It's a little bit different, or critical theory, which comes out of Germany. So Crenshaw, who coined the term CRT, notes that CRT is not a noun, but a verb. It cannot be contained to a static and narrow definition, but it's considered to be an evolving and malleable practice. That's why sometimes it's difficult to nail it down. But it critiques, in short, it critiques how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. Let me repeat that again, because I think that's the crux of it. Critical race critiques how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. CRT also recognizes that race intersects with other identities, including sexuality, gender identity, and others. CRT recognizes that racism is not a bygone relic of the past. Instead, it acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and on other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation. Why are states banning critical race theory? If you have not been grounded in this debate, I want to let you know that states are banning critical race theory. That's why I've been talking about it and writing about it lately. To understand why CRT has become such a flashpoint in the culture, it is important to understand what it is and what it is not. Opponents fear that critical race theory admonishes all white people for being oppressors while classifying all Black people as hopelessly oppressed victims. That's the rhetoric, but it's not true. These fears have spurred school boards and state legislatures from Tennessee to Idaho to ban teachings about racism in classrooms. However, there's a fundamental problem. These narratives about CRT are gross exaggerations of a theoretical framework. The broad brush that's being applied to CRT is puzzling to academics, including some of the scholars who even coined the term. CRT does not teach that white people are bad. And a lot of people will come up to me and try to debate me about CRT based on the assumption that it's this, but it's not. CRT does not attribute racism to white people as individuals or even to entire groups of people. Simply put, critical race theory states that US social institutions, i.e., example, the criminal justice system, the education system, the labor market, housing market, and healthcare system are laced with racism embedded in laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that lead to different outcomes by race. So in other words, the systems that are in place, the social institutions that are in the US, the criminal justice system, the education system, the labor market, the housing market are all set up, the healthcare system are all set up to disadvantage people of color, not even intentionally, it's just set up like that. It's embedded in the laws, regulations, rules. It's a theoretical tool, CRT is. Sociologists and other scholars have long noted that racism can exist without racists. However, many Americans are not able to separate their individual identity as an American from the social institutions that govern us. That is, many Americans are not able to separate their individual identity as American from the social institutions that govern us. These people perceive themselves as the system. Consequently, they interpret calling social institutions racist as calling them racist personally. So basically, CRT looks at the system, institution, and people cannot separate. When they think about racism, they think of it as an individual. They say, I'm not racist. But when we talk about systemic racism, we talk about systems that disadvantage one group and advantage another. Some of you know that I was the first African-American in the history of the College of Education, Department of Teacher Education, to receive tenure. And so there was a system whereby nobody African-American was able to receive tenure. I don't know about what able, but whatever happened, I was the first one. That's an example. Another example is when there's an overrepresentation of African-American boys in special education based on standardized and biased tests. CRT looks at that and asks why. Okay. Misunderstanding of CRT. Scholars and activists who discuss CRT are not arguing that white people living now are to blame for what people did in the past. We're not arguing that white people living now are to blame for what people did in the past. They are saying that white people living now have a moral responsibility to do something, white people and black people, about how racism still impacts all of our lives today. Policies attempting to suffocate this much needed national conversation are an obstacle to the pursuit of an equitable democracy. Supporters of CRT bans often quote Martin Luther King Jr.'s proclamation that individuals should be viewed by the content of their character instead of the color of their skin. They ignore the context of why Dr. King said that. So let's look quickly at the legislation against CRT. To better understand how widespread these efforts are to ban critical race theory from US classrooms, Rayshawn Ray and Alexander Gibbs of the Brookings Institute did an assessment of anti-CRT legislation. Here's what they found. 9 states have passed legislation against CRT. Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, even though it's not being taught in classrooms. It's too complex to be taught in classrooms. Arizona's legislation was overturned. And I'm almost finished. None of these states' bills that have passed even actually mention the word CRT. The legislations mostly ban the discussion, training, and or orientation that the US is inherently racist, as well as any discussions about conscious and unconscious bias, privilege. They ban the talk of discrimination and oppression. Nearly 20 states have introduced or plan to introduce similar legislation, including Florida, Georgia, Utah, Alabama, Kentucky, North Carolina, Ohio, etc. and so forth. The irony of making laws against teaching diversity. Ironically, making laws outlawing critical race theory confirms the point that racism is embedded in the law. As sociologist Victor Ray noted, some parents are worried about their children learning things in school that they do not have the capacity to address. But as a college professor myself who does teach CRT as one of the many theoretical frameworks that I bring into the classroom, students are often concerned by how little they have learned about inequality in their schools. So this is the conundrum, and I'm getting down to our discussion. Teachers in K-12 schools are not actually teaching CRT, but teachers are trying to respond to students asking them why people are protesting, why Black people are more likely to be killed by the police. CRT can answer these questions, but if we're not willing to have the discussion, we won't have an adequate answer. Ultimately, we cannot employ colorblind ideology in a society that's far from colorblind. Everyone sees it, whether they acknowledge it consciously or not. If we love America, we should want to be the best that we can be. Just transitioning CRT and educational curriculum. In our discussion with our student panelists, we will focus on the role that CRT can play in helping us understand disparities in public schooling. Education and schooling are often the battleground for political issues, and the case is no different with the CRT debate. What it may come down to is legislators dictating to educators what they can and cannot teach in their classroom. A major piece that must be addressed are the state standards. They regulate what teachers are to teach in their classroom. And from kindergarten through 12th grade, the state standards in Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, the national standards, they mandate that teachers deal with curriculum deal with diversity on a deep level. So if this legislation continues to pass, we will have a major crisis in education because the standards call for us to deal with diversity. So let's hear from our students at this particular time. As you saw, it's a complex issue, and I needed to take a little time to lay it out. For the next 40 minutes or so, I want to hear from students. So we are going to start with Kylie. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Kylie Bridgman. I'm a senior at Walnut Hills High School. I'm a member of the Student Advisory Board at Democracy and Me, and I'm also a member of Walnut Hills Student Journalism Department through our yearbook and our newspaper.
Thank you. Let's hear from Glorinella.
Hi, everyone. My name is Glorinella. I'm a senior at NKU, and I'm an elementary education major.
Nice to see you. Let's hear from Brooklyn Wilson.
Hi guys, I'm Brooklyn Wilson. I'm also a senior at NKU, and I'm also an elementary education major.
All right. Nice to have you. All right. We're going to hear from Emma Feldmeyer. Can you unmute,
Hi.
please? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Feldmeyer. I'm a junior at Wyoming High School and an intern for Democracy and Me.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Can you introduce yourself, Ms. Julie?
Sure. I'll say hi. This is Julie Copens, and I run the Democracy and Me program for WVXU in Cincinnati Public Radio. And I'm just so proud of these students. They're amazing, and I can't wait to hear their insights. I learned so much from them whenever we talk about this.
Thank you. And Julie has been the one that has allowed us to really collaborate with our local NPR station. And so we're very blessed to be able to have this partnership. And we're going to do more. By the way, let me say before I forget, this is just the beginning. We're going to do some other stuff. I may do a deeper dive on CRT where we can have a larger conversation. But meanwhile, let's get to our first question. How important is it for you to have diversity in school curriculum? Examples might include integrating the contributions minority groups made in history. Whoever wants to take that.
I would say that it's extremely important to have diversity in my school curriculum. I noticed over my elementary years, whenever Black History Month would roll around, we would continuously learn about the same historical figures on the same cycle. We talk about Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, and then we'd be done. As I moved into high school and I started taking modern world history, AP US history, US government, etc., I did find that there are so many other historical figures of color, despite those that we learned about in elementary school. And I wish that I would have seen that earlier. I wish that I would have been introduced to more concepts surrounding diversity in elementary school. And even as I moved through my high school education, I still haven't learned as much as I would hope to from my teachers. And I found myself having to educate myself surrounding diverse historical figures. And it's really upsetting and challenging that as a teenager, I'm expected to teach myself all these things about history because the education system isn't built to include that within our curriculum.
I agree with Kylie. When I went to elementary school, we mainly did like a heroes and holidays type inclusivity and diverse curriculum. And I didn't really know anything even in high school, and I didn't start learning until college because anything like this wasn't my favorite subject. I just liked science and I liked English, and that was all I liked, and that was what I stuck to. So when I got to college, I started like broadening my learning and trying to teach myself, and with help from people like Dr. Childs, I learned a lot more and I educated myself.
Why is it so important? You folks expressed an excitement when you did get an opportunity to learn about, in Kylie's case, other people besides Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King. Why is it so important to diversify the curriculum to you? Why is it so important?
I would say that it's so important to me because as a person of color, if I'm only learning about white historical figures, then I don't see myself as a history maker. And I don't see myself as someone who can innovate change and diversity. And I've had to find that within myself. And I wish that the education system was one that instilled that in our youth, and it's not. And it's important because the cycle continues if it's not changed. And it's important because if there isn't any education about the issue, then there is no solution to that being brought to the table.
I feel like it's important because as a future educator, there's so many students of color and they're not learning about people like themselves. Um, right now, I'm one of the first teachers of color that they've ever met. And to be completely honest, I didn't have a person of color teacher until I was a sophomore in high school, or a sophomore in college. So I think it's really important for these kids to learn about people like them and to have people that look like them to look up to.
I also think that not including diversity in the curriculum does a disservice to students because it encourages narrow-mindedness and it doesn't give students the full story, whether that's like history or present day society. And that's going to be detrimental to their future since students aren't learning about things like critical race theory or getting really deep down into racism until maybe college. And that's just not preparing them for real life and society.
Dr. Childs, you're on mute.
I had a really brilliant point too when I was on mute. I forgot everything I said. I'm kidding. I often hear when we teach about diversity, when we teach about Hispanic culture, Native American culture, African American culture, when we introduce narratives about women in the STEM field or women scientists, I often hear that you hate white people. That the reason that if you focus on African American history, you are discredited. You are saying that white people are bad. What do you say to that in terms of diversity? What are your thoughts? Does that necessarily mean we dislike white people when we are dealing with a diverse curriculum? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think that it means that you dislike white people. I think that it means that you're giving other ethnicities a chance to share the spotlight, because all we learn about is Europeans, white Europeans, if that, in school.
Yeah, and I think that idea largely stems from the fact that white students and white educators sometimes aren't fully comfortable with submerging themselves into diversity. And it oftentimes feels like they are so used to being in the spotlight that if you take it away from them, you're taking away their sense of normalcy and comfortableness. And that's just a criminal act. And it's not, they don't allow space for other people to share that. And that's why these systemic issues continue to build on top of each other.
And you already spoke on how much have you been exposed to diversity in curriculum at your school. I'll just add that I remember I'm back in the covered wagon days. We had these primers, these readers in first and second grade, and they had all white people depicted in them. And when they introduced a Black character, he was grossly colored in the wrong way, and it looked odd, and the eyes were bulging white. And it was based on the stereotypes that African Americans or people of color are not human. And it's a dehumanization that can emerge in the curriculum as well. So just food for thought. Here's another question. Give your thought on legislation. We heard about this legislation that is trying to get rid of curriculum, that wants to give a more comprehensive view of history. What may be some problems with that? What are maybe some challenges with trying to, as they say, whitewash the curriculum?
I know that in my own community, we recently had school board elections, and there were some candidates who were running on the basis of wanting to remove divisive politics from the school curriculum. And basically, they were using that term to mask the fact that they wanted to remove critical race theory and, topics involving race from the school curriculum because they were personally uncomfortable with it. And I think that that's a big problem. Like I said before, it just promotes one perspective, whitewashing. And it also, they're trying to manufacture a problem that's not really there. That kind of goes along with the idea that race is a social construct and that people are kind of making it something it's not. And I think it's not meant to be something that's naturally divisive. People have just made it that way.
Yeah, I feel like legislation that is attempting to ban critical race theory is truly hypocritical of politicians as they attempt to uphold the Constitution and things like that with the First Amendment and freedom of speech. If our educators cannot educate on race and all the conversations to be had surrounding it, then our youth cannot forge those conversations in their lives. I think that it does a lot of work to shelter students who are not taught about it in their homes and continue to build on the systemic problems with race, where if your parents teach you to be a certain way, then that's how you'll be because that's all you're exposed to. I think that it's important to receive perspectives on certain issues from multiple varying areas with varying perspectives and experiences. And with the banning of critical race theory, that's impossible to happen. Because if you're only surrounded by people who are like-minded with your parents, then it's hard to break out of that sheltered box that your mindset is forged in.
Thank you, Kylie. Thank you, Emma. I want to name something before we go to the next question. One of the things I do, I'm in College of Education, I'm a professor of education, and I do observations and I observe and supervise student teachers in the elementary schools, middle schools, and also secondary. And so I'm some semesters I'm in the schools pretty often, and I've never once seen, as a social studies educator, I've never once seen critical race theory taught at the elementary level. I've never once seen, this is Kentucky and Ohio, I've never once seen critical race theory taught at the middle school, never once seen it taught at the secondary level. It's a boogeyman. To teach critical race theory would require a professor of education or a law professor to come in, and then it would not even be relevant. And so I encourage those out there that are listening, do your homework, read the founders of critical race theory, Crenshaw, Delgado, Derek Bell, There's some misinformation going on out there. You couldn't possibly go back to that's why I gave the mini lecture. You couldn't possibly teach critical race theory, even at the high school level. You could use tenets of it. You can perhaps do some readings in an AP class from some of the theories, but it's completely based on field. So I wanted to name that. Other thoughts before we move on? Describe some of the challenges you have experienced as a person of color in school. Let's start with Brooklyn. I was going to go ahead.
So one of the challenges that I noticed is when we started talking about like slavery in middle school, my teachers would pull me aside and be like, if you want to step out, you can. Or anytime slavery was mentioned, people would just kind of like look at me like I wasn't there. But I don't know. It was just kind of awkward. I remember feeling kind of embarrassed to be like I was the only Black kid in school at that time. And so I was just kind of embarrassed that they would pull me aside and people would look at me.
Thank you. Kylie, can you share?
Yeah, of course. I recently actually published a blog post to Democracy and Me about this experience. So when I was a sophomore, I had my first encounter with racism. I had never been called a slur. I went to a school where I was surrounded by other Black people, so I never really felt uncomfortable in my skin color until this day. I was in my English class, which I excel in English class. It's my safe space. I feel so good in English class, writing and learning. And I was doing a project with a white peer who I had thought to have been a friend of mine. And we had a disagreement because he was used to always being right. And in this moment, he was wrong. And he decided that the only way that he could get over on me in this situation was to call me a slur. And he responded to me, "No, you monkey," when I disagreed with him. And it just slapped me in the face. And I did not know what to do. I didn't want to tell my parents about it, and I didn't. But my teacher, she had overheard it, and in the moment she didn't know how to react either, because it was her first experience with racism in her classroom as well. And it just kind of snowballed into a whole discussion about racism. And it was the first time that I had ever heard any counselors, administrations, teachers actively discuss racism in a classroom. And it was embarrassing for me because I felt like if I would have just shut my mouth and let him be right, then we could have avoided this entire situation. And it was difficult to be, the counselors would visit my classroom, and they'd, open up this conversation about race, and nobody would have anything to say. So they just put it on me. And of course I talked about it because it's something that needs to be talked about, but it was difficult that the only reason they were there was because they were reacting. It wasn't proactive behavior, it was reactionary. And that was really difficult for me. But 2 years later, I'm stronger for it. And I found my voice through the situation. So it's been really freeing to be able to write that blog post and to share now, because for any educators or administration listening, don't be reactionary, be proactive and get in front of the issue before students feel comfortable being racist in your classrooms.
Yeah, I'm smiling because you definitely learn from it. And the name of this conversation is called Courageous Conversations. And understand that as a person of color or as a woman or what have you, what my minority group you come out of, is takes courage to speak up and stand up for yourself. Well, thank you. Thank you. Other thoughts before we move to the next question?
I obviously can't speak to this question from like personally being discriminated against, but I have observed some acts of discrimination, racial discrimination. And one includes last year, I was in the weight room with my basketball team. We were lifting, and one of our trainers, a white male, he made some racist comments. So it started, I approached him because there was music in the weight room that was constantly saying the N-word. And I didn't appreciate this, and it wasn't appropriate for just any setting, much less a school setting. So I approached him on this, and he defended it. He said, and I quote, "That's just part of their culture." And I was just appalled at that comment. And then he proceeded to approach a couple of African-American players on our team and asks if that offends them. And I just thought that that was completely unfair. And I just can't imagine how those players felt being singled out like that.
Thank you for being an ally, Emma. And the N word is definitely a deep topic of discussion and controversial. And yeah, it's just uncomfortable him coming from an authority position and asking. I don't know the situation, but anytime the N word is involved, that's a discussion that needs to be had at length. So thank you for sharing that. So the next question here, and we'll start off with, we'll go back to Kylie. I often have students say to me, and I have my students, some of my students are in the audience, you're the first African-American professor or first teacher of color I've had in my whole school career. And quite candidly for me, it kind of takes me aback every time. And because I don't know how to act, I don't know what to say. I want to do a good job at being the first Black professor or Black teacher. So why is that important? How important is it to have a teaching staff that looks like you or a similar cultural background?
Yeah, so this is an extremely important thing to me. Like I said earlier, if you don't see somebody that looks like you doing something, you don't believe that you can do it either. When I was younger, I used to be like super, like I was always that kid that was playing school and like I would really like draw up the worksheets and like be playing teacher, but I never thought that like that was for me because I didn't see anybody like me doing it except for one teacher at my school that I had in elementary school. And I've been lucky enough to have 4 Black teachers in my high school career, but that's still not enough. I've taken well over 30 courses at Walnut, and only 4 of them have been Black. 2 of them were Black women, 2 of them were Black men. And when I take courses with teachers that look like me, I perform better. I feel like they understand, what's going on in my life better. I feel like they're more likely to advocate for me and make sure that I have the tools that I need to succeed. And some of the 2 best relationships that I have with my teachers, they're both white, but I still hold on very dearly to the connections that I formed with those Black teachers. And it's just, I've always felt like those classrooms were a safe space for me because I walked in and there was somebody that looked like me staring me in the face instead of somebody who knew nothing about my experience. And I think that that's really important for students to have. And I think that we should be able to have more of it. And it's difficult. And I think one thing, this is, I don't know how on topic this is, but I've noticed that the language instructors at my school very, very rarely correspond with the ethnicity behind the language that they're teaching. And I've heard from multiple of my peers that it's difficult to learn a language from somebody who doesn't live in the culture that the language embraces. And I think that that's something that is a really important conversation. For example, this is my 2nd year of Spanish. Both of my teachers have been white women. And I think that it would be so culturally immersive to be learning Spanish from somebody who's immersed in Spanish culture. And I haven't gotten that. And I think that that is something that's important as well.
Thank you, Kylie. Brooklyn, you want to respond to that?
Like I said, my first teacher of color was Dr. April Eddy. It was my sophomore year, and it was my human growth and development class. And I really do hold that connection very special because she was really into having one-on-ones with all of her students. And when it got time for us to have our one-on-one, she was like, I know how you feel, because she had her Ph.D. and she was one of the only Black women in her classroom. And so throughout my college experience, there have been very few, I will say, Black women in the classroom with me, and even less as I've progressed into my major. And so it just kind of feels like I'm being singled out anytime we talk about race or anything like that. And because I'm very vocal about it, because I have a lot of opinions on it, because I've experienced it. And April Eddy was very near and dear to my heart, and I really appreciate everything she did to me. And I will say, I definitely feel more comfortable reaching out to teachers of color than I do any other teachers, because I feel like they understand where I'm coming from, especially if we have a similar background.
Hey, Brooklyn. Emma, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, again, I can't personally say how it feels, but I know that I've only had one teacher of color throughout my 11 years of school since I'm a junior. And I mean, I can't imagine really how it feels, but I just know that that's not representative of our student body or our community. And so I don't think that's a good reflection on like who we are and who we want to be as a community.
Thank you. And I would just add that for those out there that may not understand this piece, we understand that a good teacher is a good teacher. There's a teacher shortage across the United States of America. We just need good teachers. But the research shows that when students have educators that reflect their culture or reflect their background, their ethnic background, they perform better because you can identify with that person. Also, it sends the wrong message when we have, like in the state of Kentucky, we have over 90% of the teachers are white women, and 20 to 30% of the students' body are students of color. It sends a certain message. And for example, Kylie mentioned in foreign languages, there's even more of a shortage in foreign languages because of the certification. It's difficult to get. It's one of the harder tests to pass, whether it's Spanish, French. And so a lot of the native speakers don't always pass the praxis certification. So we need more native speakers to be in foreign language education. That just highlights the teacher shortage and the lack of teachers of color in the community. In what ways can your educational institution support you? So where you currently are, talk to the educators, talk to us. How can we support you as a student of color, as a student in general? How can you be more successful by our support?
I think the BB program that exists at NKU is very helpful. It's a giant step in the right direction for students of color to be successful in the goals that they hope to achieve, especially for educators, with all of the help that they offer, like with the praxis and everything. I think it's a great thing to have.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely say at the high school level, having conversations like these is super important. My school hosted a student voices conversation during all of our lunch bells with different leaders in our school community a few weeks ago. And it was just really great to hear from other students of all backgrounds, of all minority groups that were struggling, and how administration and their teachers could help to aid them in overcoming those, and how we could work together to foster solutions. So I think really just creating space for your students to share their concerns, from the first day of school, communicating with your students that you are a safe space and that you'll be there to support them in any way is really important, because a lot of students don't have that at all.
Thank you so much. Emma, you want to respond to that?
Yeah. I also think it's really important to just form connections with your teachers. And I think a great way of doing that, at least in my experience, has been joining clubs that they run. And I think that's one way to combat kind of the difficulty in approaching some teachers, especially if they might not understand like your background or what perspective you're coming from. And so personally, I'm part of Model UN, and the teacher that runs that, I've felt that through the club, I've gotten to know her a lot better. And she's one of my favorite teachers now. So I think that's been a really great opportunity.
Thank you. And so a lot of times as adults, we miss opportunities to support students. And so if you advice to all students, if there are supports that you feel like that you're not getting, it's definitely a good idea to go talk to teachers, talk to educators, talk to administration, because a lot of times we have blind spots, we don't see it. And we got into this a little bit already. Have you faced discrimination at your school and your community? In what ways might diversifying the curriculum combat this prejudice? So seeing yourself in the curriculum can normalize people of color. Even like I'm a big advocate of diversifying literature and bringing different kinds of literature in the classroom, even in the elementary level, introducing children's books that portray Hispanics, that portray Jewish culture, that portray African-American culture. Any thoughts on this? Have you faced discrimination at your school and your community? We kind of got into this earlier.
Yeah, I actually have another experience.
Sure.
This one was with my AP US history teacher, actually. So this was my sophomore year as well. I don't even remember exactly how it started, but I just always felt like my teacher did not like me at all. And I knew that this feeling that I had was shared by the other 3 Black people in my class as well. We always felt like she was targeting us. She wouldn't call on us, and then she'd dock us on participation points. There was a time where we were taking a timed assessment, and she had already started the timer, and she actively knew that I could not log into the test, and she just refused to help me. And I didn't finish my test. And I got a little upset, and I felt targeted and I felt discriminated against because it wasn't any of my white peers who had the same feeling. And sometimes it's just like a nudge on your shoulder where you know it's racially motivated. And I addressed her about it, and I happen to think that I can communicate things effectively in a way that is not aggressive. But I felt as though she wrapped me up in this stereotype as the angry Black woman. And she got extremely defensive when I addressed her about the issue. She crossed her arms and sat back in her seat, and she was like, do I need to go get another teacher because you're not going to yell at me and accuse me of blah, 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 blah. And it was just clear that she felt attacked and then had to put all the blame on me. And because of the situation that I had earlier in that school year, I said, okay, I'm not going to talk to you. I'll just go tell the administrators. And I walked right out of her classroom, and I walked into the office, and I told them what happened. And then my dad came, and he was angry. And he just, advocated and communicated for me. And I thank him so much for that, because that same teacher the next week was trying to be my best friend because she knew that she was wrong. And that, like, for the rest of the year, I just felt so uncomfy around her, like I felt like she was trying too hard. And then, the one good thing that came from COVID was I didn't have to go to her class anymore. So, it was upsetting to have like an older white woman make me feel that way. But I got an A in her class, and I did well on my AP exam. So I definitely overcame her, stereotypes on me, but it was challenging to experience that. And she was one that taught, the diverse parts of US history. She would go off curriculum all the time and teach us about it. So I was just so shocked that she treated me that way, and the other Black students in the room. It was just very telling that sometimes history teachers mask their implicit bias and their prejudice up in the things that they teach, and they try to mask it with teaching you about the type of person that they might be. So
thank you for sharing your story. A big part of critical race theory is storytelling, the counter narrative. So thank you. Brooklyn, you want to share?
Yeah, I also have a story that I was painted as the angry Black woman. It was my senior year, and it was in a math class. And it was during the end of the year, so there was a lot of downtime. We weren't really doing anything, just sitting on our phones. And there's this girl in the back of the class, and she just kept saying the N-word with the hard R over and over and over for no reason. Like, nobody was like saying anything to her. She just kept saying it. And so then I turned around, and I was like, why are you saying this? Like, what is making you say this, and what makes you think that it was okay? I said it just like that, as calm as I could possibly be, because I'm not a very agitated person. But then she started crying. And so the teacher pulled me out into the hallway, and she was like, I think you need to apologize. You've upset her. It's like, she should be upset and she should be embarrassed, because she shouldn't be saying anything like that. So the teacher made me go back in the classroom, stand in front of the class, and apologize to the girl for crying or for making her cry. And then she made me go down to the principal's office. And I've never done anything like this before. As soon as I walked out of the door, I slammed the classroom door because like I was upset and I was angry. I've never done anything like that. I've always been like a teacher's pet and I've always tried to be a people pleaser. But I just feel like I was wrongfully persecuted and made to apologize for something that I shouldn't have had to apologize for.
Right. D'Angelo in White Fragility deals with that topic. Read the last chapter. It's called Tears of a White Woman. And it's offensive to a lot of people when you first hear that language, but it addresses the phenomenon of some white women using the tears and the sort of moral high road when they know that they're cornered to get emotional about it and not really address the issue. It's definitely a topic that people don't want to address because they feel stereotyped, but it's true. That's Brooklyn gave the perfect example. So I'll give a quick story that I wrote about. The many times or the few times I was pulled over by police, and had my car searched for drugs, even when I was in graduate school, even as a professor. When I go into stores, and especially when I was younger, accused of shoplifting. One time I was coming from work, I was a young person, and the police detained me and said that I was breaking into people's cars, and my mom didn't know where I was, and I was a minor at that time. So it happens. And the reason I gave my story and I asked these folks to give their story is because CRT is really privileges the power of storytelling. And this is our last question as we get ready to open up to the audience. And I want the audience, if you have questions, put it in the Q&A, put it in the chat. How do you see critical race theory as one of the major, let me frame this the right way. Legislators are saying today that critical race theory is one of the major threats in education today or in our society. Why or why not? Do you think that's the case? Do you agree or disagree? If not, what are issues? Go ahead.
Sorry. As a future educator, I say no, because like you've said before, critical race theory is not something that we teach in elementary and middle school and hardly really even high school. It's something that you get into in college. I think they see this word as a threat and they think that we're, like you said, we're teaching white people bad, but that's not what's going on. We're teaching diverse curriculum and they don't want their kids to come home with questions that they can't answer. And I know you said something like that, but that's the reality because they didn't have a diverse curriculum when they were in school. We didn't when we were in school and we're 20 years old.
Yeah. Other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that there are, like you talked about earlier, there are so many bigger issues in our world, and not to, diminish this one, but I feel like this is all wrapped up in so many of the other underlying issues that there are in the world. It's wrapped up in the racism, and it's wrapped up in the you know what I'm trying to say. Everybody. Yes, that word. Thank you. I can never say that word of education and race. And I just think that if those bigger issues are addressed, then this falls under those. And yeah, I wish that, it could be, weaved into our education. But I think that it's one of those conversations where we're having it right now. And if we continue to do the work as educators and administrators and students, then we can work to combat the issue a little bit.
So as we close, and I know Glorianella had to go, and Emma may have to go as well. What would you say to the audience as young people, as these are high school and college students? What would you say? What are your parting words on the importance of education, the importance of diversity in education, and the voice of minorities being heard? What were your any last thoughts you would share?
Yeah, I would definitely just reiterate a point I made earlier about being proactive, not reactionary, to get in front of the issue. And also to leave this conversation and don't leave it at that. You know, continue to um, do your research, to educate yourself, but also to have these conversations with your peers and your family members. I know Thanksgiving just passed, but you know, this would have been a good conversation to maybe bring up with some of your older relatives at the dinner table. Just because I feel like a lot of times um, people aren't comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that that's a
Mhm.
stigma that needs to be dropped, because if you're not uncomfortable, then you're not learning anything new.
Yeah.
Um, and I just think that it's everybody's personal responsibility to educate themselves as they see fit. And I hope that leaving this conversation and after hearing my stories and Brooklyn's stories and Emma's stories, that you can see that it's a conversation that needs to be had and that you make it your personal goal to, you know, bring this conversation forward in the rest of your life.
Anything you want to add, Brooklyn?
I think she said everything she needed to say perfectly.
Perfect. Okay. And you'll maybe have an opportunity to chime in our next session here. Let's go to the audience discussion. Raise a hand virtually. We can turn on your mic and video, or just your mic, or we can just read your comments if you do not want to be on camera. Dr. Burgess, one of my longtime friends, can we bring him on camera? And he can ask this question. There you are. Hey.
I don't know if you want to see me. Yeah, there.
No, it's up to you. That's completely up to you.
No, I'm good. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Childs, just your opinion on the ways in which kind of like the marginalization of qualitative and phenomenological research in education schools has contributed to us not actually giving validation to people's stories, especially of marginalized groups. I know that as someone who did qualitative phenomenological research for his dissertation, I was often considered to be less, scholarly. So I wondered how you think that affects, perceptions within higher education.
Okay, so audience, let me name something. Dr. Burgess, we talked a lot when we were in a graduate school, and he's always the one that takes me to my theory self and my philosopher. So I would answer it like this: in education, in Western society, we privilege quantitative research. That's a certain epistemology that belongs to Europe, a person, individual European background. And epistemology is ways of knowing. It's a philosophical branch that studies how we know things and what we privilege, what knowledge we privilege, and what knowledge we don't privilege. So in other words, is in order for something to have validity in Western culture, it needs to be quantitative research, which is numbers and facts. But if you understand, knowledge is broader than just memorization and rote memory and knowledge and facts. There's a whole body of knowledge that deals with storytelling, that deals with music, that deals with other ways, other epistemologies, other ways of knowing besides just what can I memorize and what can I quantify in quantitative research. That's what he's dealing with. And so the phenomenological studies, the qualitative studies, really gets at personal experiences. And I think we need more qualitative research, because then we can study the experiences of African-American youth. A lot of times people's stories, like the marginalized youth, is overlooked. And just what we're doing today is, one might discredit it as, oh, this is just people's opinion. But what CRT does is elevate the person, elevate the story, elevate the person outside of the research and say, this is a human. I care about their story. And so that's a really important point, Dr. Burgess. I think it's a Western paradigm, but the newer scholarship is really trying to get at that more in the qualitative study, qualitative meaning. How are people thinking? Why? That's why I asked, what racial experiences did you have? Because that empowers people. It's like, I'll give you another example. I was buying a used car. I wrote about this. I was buying a used car recently, and the gentleman that was a salesman, he was African American, and we really hit it off. They had another lot down the street. He said, we don't have that particular car at this lot, but let's drive to a neighboring city and we can look at the car there. And on our way there, the police pulled us over, and he straight up told us, this particular, and it looked like a suburb to me, this particular neighborhood has a lot of drug activity, so we pulled you over to check to see if you were drug dealers. With 2 Black men dressed just like I'm dressed now. What he thought I was a high profile, I must have been really pushing some keys or something in a suit. He thought I was John Gotti or somebody. So there's also research that says no matter, in many people's eyes, no matter what status you rise to, they still see you as a person of color. Highlighting those stories is so important. That Aaron named it, Dr. Burgess named it. That's exactly what we're trying to do now. Highlight people's stories, give them an opportunity to tell stories. Let's hear from Sabrina Allen. Hey, Sabrina, can you hear me?
Hey, yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? My internet's kind of unstable.
Yes, we hear you. And this is one of my brilliant students from NKU.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I had a comment about students having teachers that look like them or have the same background or culture. So although I'm white, I know you guys can't see it on camera, but I'm white. I feel it's important for white students just to see people of color in positions of power, so that they're able to learn from a different perspective and grow a respect for that person and culture. And I think that because there's a lack of opportunity because of the systematic racism that's embedded in all of our systems, that when a white student is able to learn from a teacher of color, it can change their perspective completely. Because they're bringing that home. They're telling their, if they're coming home to like a racist family, well, I have a Black teacher and he's great or she's great. And I feel like that can really impact and change a kid at whatever grade level they're at. That was all my comments.
Well, the research supports what you're saying too. Brooklyn quoted James Banks. She talked about the heroes and holidays approach of diversity, and that's a perspective that says when we deal with diversity, primarily in America, we just talk about it on Martin Luther King Day, but we need to go beyond that. But James Banks talked about also that we're smarter when we are around people different from ourselves. Diversity is good, but in the United States of America, we've had an issue with embracing diversity, whether it was the Native Americans, whether it was Chinese immigrants, whether it's the Hispanic immigrants and people from South America that are coming and beautifying our country, whether it is people from the Middle East coming here, whether it was the Irish back in the early 20th century. We've always struggled with diversity. We're so stupid in the United States of America. We don't understand that diversity makes us better. Diversity makes us smarter. You can look at most inventions around the world and in society, and most of the progress came from people different from ourselves. Diversity is good. Say it with me. Diversity is good. I remember when I was, we have a pretty a thriving, I don't want to say thriving, but we have a good number of Middle Easterners at NKU. And candidly, I haven't been around a lot of folks from the Middle East. But when I taught a summer class, I had a lot of students from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, and that was one of the best experiences I've ever had. I learned about Muslim culture. I learned that many of them they're very, very wealthy. They come from the oil money. That may be a stereotype, at least my students were, they told me all about it. And I said, no, we don't have maids and butlers here. I'm sorry. I got to get the drinks myself. But I learned so much. I learned more than I could ever learn in the textbook. So diversity is good. Julie, you had a comment?
I was just going to say, we hosted an exchange student from Pakistan for a year and completely blew our mind. And I realized how little I knew about his culture. I came from Karachi, was Muslim, and it was such an eye-opening experience. But I wanted to refer to a couple of people had some really good questions in the Q&A. I wanted to make sure we got to.
Yes.
And I think they both hit on, we could kind of maybe tie it together, this idea that this whole thing about CRT, it's not about what our kids are learning. It's really about what their parents and grandparents never learned. So we're seeing, and so the education, like the young generation, like they get it. They're cool with this diversity stuff. They know diversity is good because they see it in their world, and they are building a world where that is celebrated, whether it's gender diversity, race, background, all that. It's us and our parents that didn't get the memo. So how do we lovingly, and this is a question for the students. You've been able to do that. How do you break through that? How do we bring the education upward to those older generations who just clearly are not getting it?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I have experienced so much in my life, is that it's not me that has ever had an issue learning about diversity or being curious about it. But I am biracial, so half of my family is white and a lot of them are old. And, like I said earlier about the Thanksgiving table, at family gatherings, I find myself in so many controversial conversations with my family members. And it's hard to have them and to still love them after some of the ignorant things that are said to me. But then at the end of the day, I have to remember that they're ignorant comments, they're comments lacking knowledge and education. And, I have made it, kind of not my responsibility, but, a goal of mine to educate them on why they're wrong. I just recently got a Facebook, and it might have been one of the worst decisions I ever made, because now I find myself getting into it with distant aunts and uncles and cousins. But I think that, it's an important thing to do, because like I said, if I don't get a little uncomfortable with my family, then they will never become any more educated. And I am the only biological biracial child in my family. So it's a little difficult. And sometimes I feel a little bit of pressure to do it from like my mom. She'll be like, you need to tell them. And I'm like, no, they need to learn and they need to do their own research. But I think that it comes from the older generations finding a reason to care enough to learn and to use the internet, and to, type into the Google search bar. They need to have a reason why. And I think a lot of them don't, because they're surrounded by other old white people. And a lot of them don't have a biracial niece or nephew to, kind of tell them how the world really is. And they live in a bubble of old whiteness. And unless somebody cracks the bubble open, they'll never, break through that.
I will say one thing about my family. My family is mostly white, and I'm one of the only people of color in my family. And so Facebook has been hard for me too. I get it. I understand that feeling. One thing that I have done is I have distanced myself from a lot of my family, and I hate that I had to do that. But there was just so much hate that they would just spew out of their mouths, and I just didn't want to hear it. It was bad for my mental health, and I didn't want to be around it. And they wanted me to all go to college. I wanted to go to college for myself too, but they hated that I became educated and that I would voice my opinions. And they didn't like that. My opinions were different from theirs because I was educated.
Wow. Let me read some of the comments. And thank you, Miss Julie. Anytime you see something that I missed, let me know. Dr. Burgess said, Aaron Burgess said, is it not, in terms of CRT, is it not first and foremost a linguistic and literary theory that looks at how text, quote unquote text, marginalize certain groups of people? And when we say text, as it relates to structuralism and post-structuralism, we mean text. You can read anything. You can read people. You can read an institution. And so when we're talking post-structuralist language or structuralism language, there are other theoretical frameworks like CRT. But when you're talking structuralism and post-structuralism, everyone's a text. So you can read me. You can look at me and say, okay, he has a suit on, he's an African-American, and we can read my reaction. Sometimes our first reading is incorrect. And so that's what CRT gets at. And then it looks at how marginalized, how certain groups are marginalized. And it looks at history. A lot of times people miss this because in the United States of America, we're myopic. We have tunnel vision, and we think of things ahistorically. But we need to look at history and institutional racism throughout history, not just the here and now. And look at historically how groups were marginalized and how that affects us today. And that scares people. They may say, well, there's a Black guy on my job, he makes more money than me. But that's looking at it individually. CRT looks at things structurally and social historically, okay? Aaron, you always pull me into these deeply philosophical conversations. That's my guy. Okay, Dr. Marcus said a great conversation and much needed, wonderful here to hear the voice of the students. I'm just reading through the comments. Elgin Card, and by the way, if I say your name and you want to say more, just let us know and we'll bring you, raise your hand. It's way above almost everyone's understanding. When people ask us if we teach it, I say, what exactly do you mean? And that's the whole debate about CRT. And I think that people mean something else when they say CRT. They mean stop teaching the curriculum that's making us uncomfortable. Go ahead, Julie.
There's a question Dee asked in the Q&A very much related to that, and whether what we see as a conflict between the culturally responsive and inclusive standards that are already embedded in what we're supposed to be teaching our kids, versus this whole kerfuffle over CRT. Dee asks, how much of this controversy do you think is a disingenuous, purposeful conflating of it with culturally responsive and initiatives that are part of making sure Kentucky and Ohio standards are inclusive? So that actually, it's not a contradiction. It's a conflation. I don't know.
Yeah, the conspiracy theorist in me says yes. There are some people behind the scenes that are intentionally making the waters muddy. But sometimes also there's a fear factor. What are they teaching our children? I personally think people need to just visit the schools and sit in the classroom for a little while and see what's going on. I think it's been so long since people have been in the classroom and looked at curriculum. They make it up as they go along.
I had a question for the students. I guess it's kind of related. Yes, parents are scared. They don't know what this is. It seems bad. They don't want their kids to be uncomfortable. What about among your peers, this idea that the educational opportunity pie is a pie of a certain size, and if students of color are getting more attention or more opportunity, or then necessarily that's less pie for me? Does that come up in your peer relationships, and how do you tackle that?
Yeah, I feel like at Walnut, we're so diverse, and I've had this conversation with my friends that it's almost so diverse to where it's a fault, because we're wrapped up in all this diversity, but then we get looped into all of these conversations that, degrade us because of our race and because of our diversity. And a lot of it does come from our peers. I've seen a lot of times in classrooms where we'll be like history classrooms will have a discussion on something, and it's not necessarily tailored to race, but a white peer makes a comment on it, and then a Black peer responds, and we start having this discussion revolving the root and the systemic basis of a practice that we're discussing in history. And then other people get upset and they're like, why are we talking about race? We weren't talking about race. Why do we have to talk about it? Because they're uncomfortable with it. And it becomes this, well, I don't want to talk about that, and that doesn't affect me, so let's not talk about it. Yeah. And they're not learning because of it, because these conversations, these questions that are being asked are simply thought-provoking questions that challenge history. And I've just seen it where people feel so attacked by curriculum or conversations that's had, and they feel like they are not welcome in the community anymore. But in reality, that's the whole point of asking the questions and having the conversation. So I feel like a lot of times white peers can exclude themselves from the education that they could be getting if they just listened a little bit better.
I will say the one comment that you hear the most is, why did we have to bring race into it? Or why is it about race? And I really can't answer why they would ask that. It's just they feel like they're not getting enough, like you said, of the educational pie.
And that's the privilege to be able to not have to think about race. It is. That's what, when we talk about privilege, that's what we mean. In the last few minutes, I want to just read some comments here, and then we'll have some closing thoughts. Kennedy Card, by the way, Kennedy, if you want to come on camera, just raise your hand. She says, I think it's so important as well. This semester, I'm in the kindergarten placement. Kennedy is an education major. She's studying to be a teacher. She's in the kindergarten placement, and it makes my heart so full to have some of the Black students come up to me and say, they compliment her hair in braids, or they say, wow, your hair looks like mine, and things of that nature. I didn't have that when I was in elementary school. I'm grateful to be that person for them. That's super powerful. There's a book, there's a children's book that you might want to get called Hair, different kinds of hair. I can't remember the title, but it deals with different kind of hairstyles of people of color, particularly African Americans. There's some good books coming out of that nature. So thank you, Kennedy. Not a question, but somebody wants to thank the participants for being so open and discussing your experiences. I echo that sentiment. Dr. Bolts, she's from the law school here, Chase Law School at NKU. This is a wonderful program. I greatly value the insights of panelists. I encourage all of you to consider visiting the classrooms of Black and Brown faculty members at Chase. So if you're interested in law school, see Charlene Bolts, or see me, I'll direct you that way. I think that is a great point from Emma to make connections with students from other activities. Students through activities, okay. Just want to make sure I don't miss anybody here. Mr. Volts, Joshua Volts said, thanks for sharing that, Kylie. As a CPS teacher myself, I see this behavior from adults often. I can't and won't justify it. Our students deserve better. Dr. Jones from NKU, my colleague in the College of Education, all of your stories, realities are so powerful. So thank you for sharing. The arguments against critical race theory is the current major threat in schools today. Wow. Okay.
David, it's like those horror movies where it's like they're calling from inside the house. Not to be inappropriately humorous, but it's a little bit like that.
Those movies scare me the most. Because those movies came out before cell phones. Dr. Branham, Latanya says, such a deep level of transparency, thanks to all the panelists. And I want to read these because I want the panelists to hear how much we appreciate y'all. Okay. Let's have some closing thoughts because I'm getting into folks' dinner and bedtime. Any other closing thoughts from the panelists before we do wrap up? Okay, I want everybody to give, I'm gonna clap really loud for everybody, but I want to give our panelists a virtual round of applause for just sharing and being so brilliant. And I get to gush now. They are so brilliant. I was so emotional. So thank you so much. Okay, let me do a couple of closing remarks and then we'll be done. This is further reading. I can send you these lists. There's a go to the Democracy and Me website. There's all kinds of material there, writings and essays. You can see Kylie's essay. I've done a piece on critical race theory. I'm getting together another piece on critical race theory. You want to read Richard Delgado as an introduction to CRT. Courageous Conversations About Race by Glenn Singleton. I wrote a young adult fiction novel to offer a counter narrative for social studies called Escaping from Home. A lesson on critical race theory by Janelle George. I cited that article today. And then I cited the article from the Brookings Institute, Why Are States Banning Critical Race Theory? Homework takeaways. Okay, this is where you come in, audience. Take some aspects of what you learned today and make a commitment to implement the information. Apply it to your schools, your settings, have conversations with people. Read more on the topic. Crenshaw, Bell, Delgado, Democracy and Me articles. Give at least 2 sentences response to your thoughts. Send that to me. Okay, send me your homework so we can continue the conversation. If you're interested in the following, let us know. If there's students out there that want to be a part of BBV, or if you want to be a part of what we do, no matter what your space is, let us know. We're going to do some more things in the spring. We've been talking about doing maybe something during Black History Month or Dr. King Day, but we definitely will continue this conversation. You'll be hearing from us. If you're considering a career in education, that's what we do. Come see us. Check out, if you want to sign up to the Democracy and Me blog, to send me an email. Or if you want to just continue the conversation, I would love you just to drop a line. Thank you for your support. We are early. The cutoff time was 7:30. So send us an email. Thank you so much. We are signing off. Have a good day, everyone. See you later. Bye.